puts it behind his chair, and of course he's going to adjust all his pieces. He first turns his knights towards the inside, adjusts his pawns, plays knight f6, but doesn't press the clock and takes 20 seconds to make his first move. But now he's very quick. It's the queen's gambit declined and the semi-Slav on the board. Bishop g5 leads to very sharp lines, but Magnus goes for the Cambridge Springs variation. Look at this queen. Very sneakily, it is not just pinning but also eyeing the bishop. Bishop b4. You can take on c4 to attack here, but for now the line that is being played is somewhat, not the main line, but is played quite often. Knight e4, attacking the bishop. Now you can take on e4, but it has to be calculated carefully, because look, after you take, pawn takes, the queen attacks the bishop. You have to save it. So Maxim takes it, Magnus takes it back and saves his bishop to h4. What is Magnus's plan? Because this looks oh, he snatches the pawn. You can't take it because knight takes a2. There's a pin here. Queen c2 played, defending the pawn. And now the problem here is, if you defend your e4 pawn with f5, I'm simply going bishop e2, and after castles, which is a big blunder, in comes bishop e7. And if you take, you lose the queen. So these are all the traps in the position. Magnus would do well not to cling on to this pawn. In fact, if he just moves his queen back, that would be much better. But f5 looks so tempting to keep your extra pawn. However, the lead in development would be a bit too much. Also, the bishop on c8 is not developed. The rook on a8 is also outside the game. So Magnus must sort of not get greedy here and just simply bring his queen back. He's taking his time. You can see he's down to 1 minute 54 seconds. He brings his queen back. Maxim has 2 minutes 40 seconds. He takes the pawn on e4. That's a very healthy pawn. And now white is definitely better out of the opening, because he can also develop his bishop, then castle. And if you play a move like short castling here, then already bishop e2, and you can sense that the bishop on c8 is unhappy. How does Magnus, the greatest player right now on the planet and the strongest one in the tournament, solve his problems? Well, he goes queen f5 and he tells Maxim, can we exchange the queens? Can we trade the queens? But look, if you trade, after ef5, your pawn structure is mangled. White's pawns are beautiful. You won the a2 pawn, which is kind of a side pawn. Maxim takes, he takes f5. Now the structure is terrible. Bishop comes out to d3, attacking the pawn, and Magnus goes knight b6. Now Magnus's aim is to attack c4 with bishop e6 and put pressure here. It is quite a decent way to play. You can go king e2, and when bishop e6 is played, you can play your pawn to b3, but Maxim castles, which is also a very fine move. He castles, and now Magnus must attack this pawn on c4. If he plays bishop e6, that would be fine. Yes, he does it. Now, I think a great move here is either b3 or c5. If you attack the knight on c5, now if you play here, this is a terrible move, because you can't take with the bishop. f5 pawn is hanging, so you have to take back with the pawn, and now this is a terrible structure. White is clearly better. So what you want to do is, you want to take here, pawn takes, but then if you play knight d5, there is c4, and if you play knight c4, there is rook a1 with the other rook moving in, and then two rooks playing here, just like Benko gambit, but without having to sacrifice the pawn. So a very good move is c5, but you can sense that Maxim is tempted to play d5, and he plays it. He plays d5, and his point here is that your king is still in the center, my bishop is here. Magnus takes on c3, very important move, because if you had taken directly, the knight would have taken on d5. Now d, bishop b2, the speed at which Magnus is making his moves is superb. Now rook is attacking the bishop, you need to move it. Where? If you go back here, it would lead to triple pawns, and also c5 would be on cards. So bishop a3 is the correct move, because you're stopping c5. Also your bishop can go back at the right time. Bishop f5. Maxim takes this pawn, and now bishop c5 would be a normal natural move, just bringing back the bishop, solidifying the position. Magnus goes g6, a very dangerous move, because while he's attacking the bishop, he's also weakening the dark squares in his position. At some point, the bishop could come to f6. With 1 minute 12 seconds on the clock. What is Maxim going to do? He goes bishop h3. He plays his bishop back. And now Magnus must decide how to continue. Playing f5 would be a bit too silly because e4 opens it up and this pawn is very strong. So he takes the pawn, bishop takes e6 and bishop c5. Now look at the tactical alertness. If you take, there's no time for c5 because the bishop is hanging. So he goes back and knight a4. What a move. Because if you take here, knight c5 is a fork. Generally such move wouldn't even cross your mind because b7 is hanging. Bishop e5 played, brilliant move, rook f8, and now Maxim must not get tempted by bg7. bd4 is an excellent move, stopping knight c5. No, he plays bishop e5 and Magnus sacrifices an exchange. This is a great sacrifice because now, even though the material as for the pawns is equal and black is an exchange down, the a pawn is too strong. f4, a4, look at Magnus's knight here, cannot be moved. The a pawn pushing down, the bishop ready to control the queening square. And while white is trying to create his play on the king side, it seems a bit too slow. What brilliant assessment by Magnus Carlsen. This is absolutely genius. But now the rook comes in and says, I'm going to blockade on a2. What is your plan, Magnus? Because even if you play bishop g7, I have f6. But Magnus goes knight e4, first controlling the f6 square and also at some point can jump into c3, fg, hg, the pawns are traded. 45 seconds for Magnus Carlsen, 34 for Maxim Matlakov. He goes bishop e6, but now Magnus attacks the rook. He hits it here. Now the rook, if it moves away, then a2, a1 is incoming. So you have to come up, rook a2. But now the knight can jump into c3. He does it. He attacks the rook. The rook has to move. Oh my god, but you know, there's one hope for Maxim. If he plays c5, his bishop can go back and stop the pawn. He goes rook c2. Magnus going to push the pawn. Rook a1 played, and now look at this. If you go knight e2 check, rook e2, bishop a1, there's c5 attacking here. So he goes king e7. What a brilliant move. The bishop can no longer remain on this diagonal. It has to move, and then he plays this. Magnus finds this move literally in couple of seconds. Now knight e2. That is ultimate chess. Now bishop a1. There's no way you can stop the bishop coming out and pawn queening.